Hi, welcome to Concordia's weekly message. Some of you are tuning in for the first time, so I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Richard. I'm Concordia's pastor. Thanks for being here with us today. A couple of things to get you through this experience today. There's some singing elements we've put at the beginning and at the end. Think about that as you're singing in home with people in heaven who are joining you, singing you, and celebrating that Jesus is alive. To help you get the most out of this message today, I want you to know there's a couple of spots in here we're going to ask you to pause. You'll get the most out of it if you actually work through those pause sections and do what we ask you to do there, and then hit play again and get back into the message. There's an opportunity, if you've never given before, to give to the work and ministry of Concordia, or let me suggest, if it's your first time, to give somewhere that you're already connected with, to give somewhere where in your community, in your neighborhood, in the world, a cause that you're a part of, because here's why we give. Generosity is close to the heart of God. In fact, that's what we found out, that God is a generous God. And every time that we give, we take steps closer to God's heart. You know, I got to tell you, that's a good thing. If God does move you to give here at Concordia, there's some secure ways to do that through our online platforms, our app, or our website. Again, there's going to be some sing elements coming at you now. Thanks for being here today. God bless.
Darkness, you were waiting, without hope, without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes, to fulfill the law and prophets. To the Virgin came the word, from the throne of endless glory to a cradle in the dirt. Reveal the kingdom coming, bound to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering you saw to the other side, knowing this was our salvation. Jesus, for our sake you died. Till the stone was moved for good, for the Lamb had conquered death. And the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe, for the souls of those who'd come to the Father were restored. And the church of Christ was born, then the Spirit lit the flame. Now his gospel of old shall not kneel, shall not faint. By his blood and in his name, in his freedom I am free. For the love
It seems almost an understatement to say, in this past year, people have lost a lot. They have, haven't they? Lost loved ones, lost health, lost jobs, or in the year of missing out, lost the opportunity to go to prom, lost the opportunity for graduation, lost the experience with sports teams and activities. There's been a whole lot of people that haven't been able to be at family things like funerals and weddings. I'm thinking back to, we had a wedding we were really looking forward to going to, our niece's wedding, and we couldn't go because of COVID. There's people who even lost the opportunity to say goodbye face to face because nursing homes and hospitals had a no entry sign put up. I mean, that's a lot of loss and a lot of pain. And with that loss and pain comes a lot of grief. In fact, with all the loss and the pain we've had this past year, I think you might say there's not just a wave of grief that's coming. Maybe it's a tsunami, a tidal wave of grief. And in fact, it might already be here, even in the church. Now, track with me on this one for the church. If you're a church person, I've read that there's all sorts of lashing out in church world this year, especially against pastors and leaders. And I think the reason for that is grief. Maybe grief we don't even recognize is grief. See, here's what's going on. The church world experience isn't normal anymore. This past year, it's not been what we're used to, not what we've grown up with, not what we like, not what we're familiar with, not what we want. And people have lost some of the things that they hold really dear, like the way that we do worship together. And they're wondering, am I ever going to get that back? And people are, whether they know it or not, they're grieving that loss. Now, again, follow me on this. If they're grieving, there are these stages of grief that you go through. And the initial stage is denial. Hey, it's not even there. This is going to be over quickly. There's not any real problem. Well, when you work through that one and come to grips with the reality of, there's an issue, then the next thing that happens as you're grieving is anger. Right? And why is this happening? Anger at the people that are making it happen or saying no or telling you can't do this. And then you find yourself, and I've been here in places too, kind of grumpy about everyone and almost everything, and things that in another year might have just been seen as kind of really small things have turned out to be really big things. And you feel like you want to be in control and you're not, and that makes you angry, and sometimes so angry that it just kind of clouds your judgment, and you start not seeing things as clearly as you once did, and people that you used to have grown over time to be able to know and trust, you start not trusting, and you start thinking the worst, not the best, and then that anger starts lashing out. Right? It starts lashing out at people, usually at others, and sometimes even at God. Grief has gripped our lives, even in church world. Grief has gripped our lives, it's gripped our churches, and one man's perspective, that's kind of confusing and frustrating space. Guess what? We're really not the first ones to face this sort of thing. We just come through the story of Good Friday and Easter. And if you believe the stories are true, then you understand what it means. That Good Friday means that our sins can be forgiven because Jesus paid the price for that. You know that Easter means that Jesus rose from the grave so that the power of sin and death and the power of the devil have been defeated. So you know that, and you know that because of that we got hope for the future, no matter how cruddy the present might be. But what I don't think we understand quite as well is just how much the events of that weekend rocked the world of Jesus' followers. Right? How confused they were, how jumbled their emotions were, even after they saw the empty tomb. And how their new normal was going to be anything but normal and very different from what they thought their lives should look like. Kind of like where we are now, facing a normal that's a new normal that we're not exactly sure what it's going to be like. Well, what we're going to look at in this conversation and in the weeks ahead is how Jesus leads us through that. How Jesus leads us through the new normal so that, and today especially, we're going to talk about grief. So that when this tsunami of grief comes, that we're actually surfing the tidal wave rather than being crushed by it. To help us get into that, I want to ask you to take a moment just to pause right now and reflect on something. Pause and reflect on what this last year's been like for you. All right, what losses have you endured? And which ones have hit you particularly hard? And why do you think that is? Don't just reflect. Go ahead and take out your phone or your note field or a piece of paper and write those things down, because we're going to come back to your list in a little bit. Then when you're ready, go ahead and hit play, and we'll get into the story from the Bible today.
Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they've taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they've put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go find my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." Then she gave them his message.
Okay, so if you look at that story, you see that Mary Magdalene here she's really kind of overwhelmed by grief. She's wailing, she's crying, she can't pull herself away from the tomb. My question is this: why did this grief and loss seem to hit Mary particularly hard? Well, let me take you back into her backstory, because that's important. First of all, you go back and you find in Luke chapter 8 that Mary Magdalene, she was one of those healed by Jesus. And it was a pretty major deal. Luke 8 says she had 7 demons in her, and Jesus cast those all out. So Mary's got this overwhelming gratitude for what Jesus had done. Then there's also some stuff that evidence that after that she followed Jesus and kept following him, and may have even been a woman of some means who supported Jesus' ministry financially, so she's kind of invested in that for several years. And then you also put the fact that Mary was a witness to the crucifixion. Now, most of the disciples weren't. They ran away. John came back. Mary was there too, and so she saw all those excruciatingly horrible events and had to be a little bit traumatized by that. And then Mary also was one of those who witnessed Jesus actually being put into the grave, into the tomb. It'd be kind of like being at graveside and having the casket closed and seeing it lowered in, and Jesus' death hit her hard. Now Mary was also among the first to see the empty tomb. and to discover that there's no body. And, well, that one she couldn't believe. So let me take you back into John chapter 20, and right at the beginning, when she finds there's no body, she's like, what do I make of this? I'm going to run and tell Peter and John what I'd seen, or more accurately, what she didn't see. And then, if you're following along in that text of John 20, Mary kind of makes her way back to the tomb for a second look at things. Now, why would she do that? Well, maybe she thought that, well, if I hang out there at the tomb, somebody will be around and eventually come there who'll give me an explanation for things. But remember, she's also in this overwhelming grief, and I think it's probably more likely she's just hanging out back at the grave because that's what a lot of people do. You go to the grave of a loved one and you hang out there because somehow it makes you feel closer to them. So Mary makes her way back, and maybe she's hoping this second trip will at least make her feel closer to Jesus. But what happens is, at first, is the trip doesn't make it any clearer or make her grief any lighter. It's just like, it looks as if this second trip back actually intensifies her grief and her pain and her sense of loss. Now, I've already talked about how the death of Jesus would have hit her hard in the first place. Well, here's what's going on here. Now she's back at the tomb again, and she looks in and she still finds no body. Okay, and the only thing that can cross her mind is that the same enemies who put Jesus to death now have desecrated the tomb and taken away the body. And that's like the final insult in a society where burial, a proper burial, was important. So again, the loss of Jesus is hitting her hard. So if you're following along with me in your Bibles, again, we're in John chapter 20, and you jump down to verse 11, 12, 13, and what you find is Mary's now, she's weeping again. She's crying. I wonder if you could translate the term crying, wailing there. I mean, I think you probably could. And she looks in again through her tears, and she still doesn't see Jesus. Right? So the loss is hitting her really hard. And her pain is intense, and her grief's weighing on her. Right? Quite heavily, in fact. Can you relate to Mary? Mary's grieving. She's hurting deeply at this loss. She's probably not understanding anything about why it's so overwhelming or anything about these grief stages she's going through. She's just hanging out at the grave, and she's hurting. Now, if you look back at the list you just made, you might be nodding your head and going, yeah, Mary, I get it. I feel your pain. I'm hurting just as much. And I'm just as confused. I'm just as overwhelmed. But here's what you see happening. That Mary, even though she's confused and weighed with grief and overwhelmed, doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it. And, maybe you're there too. Mary came back to this place that brought all these things of grief and pain and loss to the forefront, the empty grave, but that's still not helping much. The only thing so far that she can think to explain this is, well, they've taken away the body, and that just adds anger into the mix, and she's stuck with her grief, stuck with her pain, and she just can't see a way through. She does see two angels, though I'm pretty sure she doesn't really connect that they're angels right then. And those angels, they could have helped her understand what's going on. They ask why she's crying. And she doesn't really stick around to listen. She just goes with this whole, they've stolen the body sort of thing. And then verse 14, she almost immediately turns away from these angels who could have given her a little more information. And she sees Jesus. But she just doesn't recognize him. Her grief is crushing her, and she can't see Jesus, which is the way it is sometimes, isn't it? Grief kind of clouds our vision and keeps us from seeing what's really there. Or maybe I should say, who's really there. Let me take you back into that part of John 20 and read it again. Down to verse 14. She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. it was Jesus. But she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you've taken him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. Now Mary sees Jesus standing there, right? And she knew Jesus is quite well, which is why the grief hit her so hard, but she just doesn't recognize him, which is like really strange, isn't it? And that does raise sort of an interesting question for us, because we sometimes find ourselves in the same position. The question is, well, what keeps us from seeing Jesus when he's right in front of our eyes? What keeps us from recognizing Jesus in the midst of our grief and our pain and our loss? That actually would be a productive thing to think about, to spend some time going through, because once you identify what some of those blinders are, you can kind of work on taking them off so you can recognize Jesus a little more clearly. But that's not John's big concern here as he's writing about what happened. All right, John's big concern, and what's instructive to us, I think, as we wade through our own grief and pain and loss that's sometimes overwhelming, is what comes next. And what comes next is that John doesn't dwell on why Mary's not able to recognize Jesus. The important thing to John is to see how Jesus reveals himself to Mary. How Jesus cuts through the fog, how Jesus lifts the veil that's on her eyes, how Jesus shows, hey, it's me. I'm here. I'm here with you. I'm alive and I'm well, and I'm here to help you through your grief and your pain and your loss and help her find her joy again. So here's what happens. Back to verse 16. "Mary," Jesus said. Mary. That's it. One word. One simple word, one personal word, a word that's spoken to the heart. It's the voice of Jesus that made all the difference, isn't it? The voice of Jesus that made the difference. Mary hearing Jesus even when she couldn't see Jesus. And you know what? To me, that actually makes sense if you believe what Jesus told us. That the good shepherd, when he calls his sheep do indeed know his voice. I mean, check that out sometime this week in John chapter 10. You'll see what he says. When the good shepherd calls his sheep, the sheep do indeed know his voice. And that's what happened here. Jesus called Mary by name, and Mary recognized Jesus' voice. And it's that voice of Jesus that cut through the fog of her grief and her pain and her loss, and it spoke to her heart. And that's what helped her start surfing through that tsunami of grief instead of getting crushed by it. Now, at this point, something else happens too. When Mary recognizes Jesus, she starts holding on to Jesus for dear life. Holding on, like perhaps thinking, well, man, if I let go of him, I may never see him again. Now, Jesus actually uses that to take her one step farther, to keep her surfing out of that grief and that pain. Let me take you to verse 17. All that's going on, Mary's holding on to her, and Jesus says this, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Jesus' point here is like, Mary, don't bring everybody back here for a picnic, all right? Don't bring everybody back here for a picnic at the grave because you're saying, hey, Jesus is there, he's alive, it's all going to be just the way it was before, because now that you've seen that I'm alive, the mission has changed. Mary, it's not sit and soak anymore. It's go and tell. Go and tell. Now Mary could have kept clinging to Jesus and said, well, no, Jesus, I don't want to lose you again. She could have argued with him about what this new normal was going to be. She could have grieved that loss of her vision of what her place was in that new world. She could have grieved that almost as much as she grieved the death of Jesus. But to Mary's credit here, she didn't do that. All right? She heard his voice, and she believed his word, and she acted upon it. Here's what verse 18 says. Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, I've seen the Lord. Then she gave them his message. She believed his word and acted on what he said, even though it wasn't necessarily what she wanted. And that too was a part of the healing. That was a part of the way through the grief and the pain and the loss. Now, I'm not a surfer. I used to watch surfing, and I've talked to enough surfers to let me know that one surefire way to get swamped by the wave is to look back. To look back at where you've been rather than at where you're going. And Jesus doesn't want that to happen to us. He doesn't want us to get crushed by the weight of our grief and our loss and our pain. So Jesus turns our eyes forward. He turns our eyes forward toward the future, right? And a new mission in a new normal, which might not be what we want, but it's what is. And it's what's necessary in the new normal. And Jesus knows that accepting that and looking forward to the new mission is another step into surfing the tsunami rather than being crushed by it. You know what? That's a real challenge for us, just like it was for Mary. So before we go on, I want you to hit pause again and reflect on this. What does it mean to look forward in the new normal rather than looking back? And how does looking forward in your new normal help you deal with your losses and your grief? And where do you need Jesus to help with that? Go ahead, hit pause, kind of work through that, and then we'll come back. So as we're connecting Mary's story and our story and this whole idea of overcoming grief, what is it that we can learn from Mary's story today? Because, we too are dealing with lots of grief in this first part of 2021. Grief and loss that's been building through much of 2020, right? Death, lots of it. And not all COVID related. If not death, there's loss and lingering pain. Some of it physical, a lot of it emotional. Some of it even spiritual, as you kind of wondering how God could let something like this happen. If not loss and lingering pain, then there's the loss of things that we were supposed to be able to have done and couldn't, and maybe still can't. Or if not that loss of lingering pain, there's that, as we're working through those stages of grief that we don't even know what's going on, there's this anger that's bubbling up, even in church world, and even against leaders in church world who are just trying to do their best. And then there's the lingering pain of like a job that is way more stressful than it ever was. Maybe you're there. Our world that seems to be irrevocably changed and not for the better. Even a church world that seems to be radically different. And the tidal wave just keeps rising. Right? It's like you see it coming. We want it to go away. We want it to head somewhere else. But it just keeps heading straight for us. My guess is it's probably on your shores somewhere already. And maybe the weight of it all is already crushing you. So, what can we learn from this story of Mary to help get us through that sort of grief and pain and loss? Well, if you still got it, go back and look at that list of your losses that you wrote down. Those things that you're grieving at right now. Okay, my question is this, as you're looking at that list. Why can't you find your way past it? All right, or why can't you find your way through it? Perhaps it's because you're where Mary was in the beginning of this story. Kind of overwhelmed and trying to find a way through it all by herself. That doesn't work, does it? It just doesn't work. The weight of this grief is just too heavy. We just can't do it by ourselves. Good thing we don't have to. We don't have to. See, Jesus doesn't want our grief and our pain and our loss to suck us under and crush us with its weight. Jesus is alive, and he's well, and he's here even though we can't see him. He's here right where we need him to be. Right? He wades right into the middle of our grief and our loss and our pain in order to give us hope. Not by minimizing the loss, okay? Not by minimizing the loss, but by showing us that we're not seeing everything that's there. Here's what I see in this story. I see Jesus acknowledging that, guys, grief is real. And so are all those stages of grief, like denial and anger, that cause us to lash out sometimes in our grief and our pain. I also see that grief can keep us from seeing things that we should. So can our preconceptions or assumptions, like Mary's, hey, they've taken the body. That also kept her from seeing that it was Jesus. But I also see this. Jesus is not put off by our emotions or by our preconceptions. Right? The good shepherd knows his sheep. And he knows that we need him. He knows that we need him, especially when the grief and the loss is almost crushing us under its weight. And so what Jesus does is he shows up to help us through, whether we see him or not. Right? He shows up and he's just there. And then when the time is right, it's Jesus' voice that cuts through the fog. It's Jesus' voice that helps us to begin to see things that we didn't even know were there. It's Jesus' voice that helps us take our steps through our grief and our pain and the loss till we can start to find our joy again. And just like he was with Mary, Jesus is patient with us. He just comes alongside and wades into our grief and our pain, and then he comforts us in our sorrows by letting us hear his voice. And then he helps us take the next step that we can take. Now, the next step, sometimes, as I found out many, many days this past year, sometimes just putting one foot in front of the other is a win. And I've also found out that there are some times that I'm so stuck that I can't even put one foot in front of the other. But that even then, Jesus is still there. He's still there in the fog and the weight of the hurt and the pain, and he's holding on, and he's holding me close, and he's maybe at times even moving my foot for me, and helping me take those steps that I even didn't know I could because I didn't see him, or I was so overwhelmed by the weight and the pressure of the grief and the loss that was closing in. And again, it's his voice that leads me there. So here's my advice for what it's worth. If you see that tsunami of grief coming, or if it's already weighing you down, when you can't see Jesus, keep listening for Jesus. When you can't see Jesus, keep listening for Jesus. Mary came back to the tomb because that's where she thought she knew that Jesus would be. Where do we know we're going to hear Jesus' voice? Well, we know he's going to be in his word. Right? So that's what, if there's one thing you do out of this message today to help you start taking those steps forward through your grief so you can not only have it not weigh you down, but you can start surfing again, listen for Jesus' voice. And listen for Jesus' voice where you know it's going to be. In the stuff that's written down. In the Word. Here's what I want to encourage you to do this week. Go to one of those places, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, that writes down some of the life and the sayings of Jesus. Okay? Go there. I'm going to suggest maybe start at John, because John writes more of the things that Jesus said than the other guys did. Maybe start at chapter 10, where he starts talking about the voice of the Good Shepherd. So just read through those stories of Jesus this week, and let Jesus speak to your heart. Let his voice cut through all the clutter and all the pain and all the overwhelmingness of the grief and the loss, and just listen for his voice so that you can start to heal. And then take the next step and even start surfing that wave.
This has been a long year. A year of uncertainty, struggle, pain. We've watched a virus take countless lives. People we knew, people we loved. Jobs have been lost. Businesses have shut down. And churches have been forced to close their doors. We've witnessed division on an unprecedented level. Cities filled with violence, streets filled with protesters. And we felt the sting of racism, the deep heartache of hate. There have been times where it's been difficult to see the hand of God. But even in the darkest of moments, he has been there, faithful, present, powerful. As a new year begins, we stand on a simple truth. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They'll soar on wings as eagles. They'll run and not grow weary. They'll walk and not grow faint. We don't know what this new year will hold, but we know that it's held by a God whose mercies are new every morning. This is where we place our trust. This is the truth on which we stand. This is our hope for the new year.
I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. I
was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. You called my name and I walked out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Mercy has freed my soul. Freedom is all that I know. The old made new. Jesus, when I met you, you called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy. Chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan. Now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Well, love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open. 'Cause when you called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious